Before I dive into today's sermon, I want to share with you something really exciting that happened to me this past week. I was at a conference downtown, and Peyton Manning happened to be at that same conference. So I got to meet Peyton Manning. Isn't that really cool? During one of the breakout sessions, we were seated at the same table, and so I had the opportunity to tell him a little bit about this innovative, unique congregation. He seemed genuinely intrigued to the point that he said, "Hey, I'm going to be in town the next couple weeks." He said, "I've already got plans for this Sunday, but would it be okay if I came to your church the next Sunday, next week?" I said, let me think about that. Yes, we would be honored. So, next Sunday, Peyton Manning will be in the house. Now, don't mob him at the door. Don't everybody ask for an autograph. Don't drool. Be cool, all right? Just let him experience worship among us. By the way, I have a confession to make. Please don't hate me. What I just told you did not really happen. I said, don't hate me, all right? I made it up, and I know preachers are not supposed to do that, but I did it for a really good reason. I know what you're thinking. You'd better have a really good reason. So here's my really good reason. You know that rush of excitement that you just felt when you knew that someone important was going to be with us? That's what Christmas is about. Amen. We Christians believe that there came a point in space-time history when somebody much greater than Peyton Manning, if that's possible, the Son of God, the Prince of Heaven, decided to pay us a visit. Think about that. We've heard it so many times, we become immune to it, but think about that. If that's true, it changes everything. If that's true, it has the potential to change every moment of my existence. How so? Let's talk about that today. God, we've heard about Christmas so much, we've almost become immune to it. Old hat, oh yeah, that again. Help us today to be able to hear with fresh ears. Help us to be able to feel it at a visceral level like never before, so that we can go out of here and live it at a visceral level like never before. We ask in the name of Jesus. Amen. Someone in our congregation this past week sent me a cartoon showing the family dog giving the family cat a Christmas present. The cat takes one look and says, "This is an empty bag. You mean to tell me you're giving me an empty bag?" The dog sheepishly says, "Yeah." In the next frame in the cartoon, the cat has jumped into the bag and says, "It's perfect. It's the best gift ever." It's so cool when you get a great Christmas gift, right? What's at the top of your Christmas list this year? What's something that you want Santa to bring you this year? Somebody tell me. Money. A new car. Your kid, a horse. Okay. At Christmas time, we give and receive gifts to celebrate and to remind ourselves that on Christmas, God gave us the best gift ever, the gift of presence. In his book, The Jesus I Never Knew, Philip Yancey refers to Earth as the visited planet. I love that turn of phrase because it helps me see Christmas through fresh eyes. You've probably seen the Xfinity Comcast commercial that's running right now where E.T. comes back to see Elliot. Elliot's little kids are out in the backyard when they notice some mysterious figure duck behind the snowman. And so cautiously they approach, and suddenly E.T. pops his head out from behind the snowman. The kids scream. E.T. screams. Elliot rushes up and says, "E.T., you came back." Imagine if during our lifetime an alien actually touched down on planet Earth. It would be the biggest news in the history of humanity. We Christians believe that actually happened, that an alien life form, a divine life form, the Son of God, humbled himself and came to us in human flesh. In ancient times, in the old prophecies, prophets looking as far into the future as they could see, seem to vaguely perceive that someday that might happen. For example, in the oldest part of the Old Testament, Numbers 24, verse 17, Balaam, the prophet said, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall rise out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." Several hundred years later, as we saw a couple weeks ago, the prophet Isaiah picked up this theme and got even more specific, saying in Isaiah 9:6, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." This was a prophecy that someday, in some form, God was actually going to visit our planet. 700 years later, on an obscure night, in an obscure village called Bethlehem, an obscure child was born in a stable next to an inn, seemingly just another among the billions of children to be born in the history of humanity. But then angels appeared in the sky and began to announce to shepherds in the surrounding region that this was the moment, that this was the one that we had been waiting for. Who? Waiting for who? What kind of child is this? Today's gospel passage gives us the answer. After the angel had announced to Joseph the impending birth of Jesus, the text goes on to say in our key verse, Matthew 1:22, all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophets. "Look, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," a Hebrew name that means God is with us. God is with us. The gift of presence. It finally happened with the birth of Jesus. God was no longer way out there somewhere. With the birth of Jesus, we no longer had any reason to believe that God is distant, remote, and disconnected. The Son of God humbled himself, took on human flesh, and came to us. Oh, to have been there that night. To have seen the angels. To look into the baby's eyes. Do you ever think about that? What it would have been like if you had actually been there. Oh, to have been alive when Jesus was alive and walking the earth. Do you ever think about that? To have beheld his miracles and wonders, and to have witnessed him at his resurrection. To have known him and actually been able to experience the wonder of who he was. The problem with that way of thinking, though, is that it misses the point completely. Do you know what were the very last words that Jesus spoke before he ascended? The very last thing he said to us? Matthew 28:20. Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Let those words sink in. remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. So the gift of the presence of Jesus that God gave was not just for one generation. The greatest gift ever that God gave on that first Christmas wasn't just for people who were lucky enough to be alive back then. It was a gift for all people, for all time, a gift for you, a gift for me, even in our time. One Sunday morning, Joyce Parsons and her grandson and her adult children were leaving the family home, getting in the vehicle to head to church, when her 3-year-old grandson found a quarter in the driveway. When they got back home from church, pulled into the driveway, got out of the car, he pulled the quarter out of his pocket, handed it to his grandma and said, "Here, you can have this. I was going to give it to Jesus, but he wasn't there." Too many of us live like that. Like Jesus was once here, but is no longer. That misses the whole point. Not long after the crucifixion of Jesus, 2 of his followers were walking one day from Jerusalem to a little village called Emmaus, a 7-mile journey, a whole day on foot. As they were walking, they were talking with each other and processing their grief, talking about how stunned they were and how much they missed Jesus and how much they wish he could still be there with them, when alongside them comes a stranger on their journey, and noticing their sadness says, "Why are you so sad? What were you talking about?" They go on to tell him about Jesus and how they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but then he was crucified and killed, and now their hopes were dashed. This stranger must have been quite learned, because he then started to remind these followers of Jesus of some of the ancient prophecies that seemed to suggest that the Messiah had to suffer and die in this way. By the end of their day's journey together, they had bonded enough that the 2 followers of Jesus asked the stranger to share the evening meal with them. At the table, the stranger broke and blessed the bread, just like Jesus used to do. What a coincidence. Kind of spooky. Then he lifted the cup and blessed it, exactly the way Jesus used to do. At which point, these 2 followers say, "Are you? Could it be?" And poof. Luke's gospel tells us the stranger disappeared out of their sight. The 2 disciples look at each other and realize that all day long they had been in the presence of Jesus and almost missed it. Don't miss it. Remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And if that's true, it changes everything. For starters, if that's true, it means God is still with us. That Jesus didn't go nowhere. That therefore, there is no shortage of power. In any situation that you or I face, if God is still with us, if Jesus hasn't gone anywhere, then that means anything is possible. Sometimes online and elsewhere we hear so many miracle stories that it can seem like a dime a dozen. And we find ourselves thinking, did that really happen? But here's a miracle story thoroughly vetted and well documented by the 2 doctors who were most intimately involved in the situation, Dr. Harold Adolph and Dr. Thomas Marshall. Dr. Adolph says that Barbara was as hopelessly ill as any patient he had ever cared for. During her first 16 years of life, Barbara was vibrant and healthy. In high school, she played the flute. She was a gymnast. But then she began to experience the loss of motor control. The diagnosis was progressive multiple sclerosis. Over the course of the next 16 years, Barbara's condition gradually deteriorated. At one point, she lost all function in one lung and 50% of the function in the other lung. She lost control of her bodily functions. She became legally blind. At one point, they had to insert a trach tube. She became so weak that ultimately she was confined to bed rest, her body contorted like a pretzel. When the doctors estimated she had only about 6 months left to live, she went into the hospice process. It was during that time that one day, her aunt and 2 friends were sitting next to her bed, reading to her prayers of healing written in letters from her friends, when Barbara heard a voice behind her, which was odd because there was no one else in the room. The voice said to her, "My child, get up and walk." She began to rustle in her bed like she wanted to move, so one of her friends leaned forward, put her finger on her trach tube so that Barbara could speak. Barbara said to them, "I don't know what you're going to think about this, but God just told me to get up and walk. Get my family," she said. "I want them to be here." Dr. Marshall writes about what happened next. He said Barb felt compelled to do immediately what she had been divinely instructed to do. So she literally jumped out of her bed and removed her oxygen. She was now standing on legs that had not supported her for years. Her vision was back. She was no longer short of breath. Her contractions were gone, and she could now move her hands and feet freely. She danced around the room, hugging her family. The next day, Dr. Marshall gave her a thorough medical exam, including imaging. He said, "Barbara, there is no medical explanation for this, but the images show that your lungs are back to normal and that the intestine that we vented to the abdomen is now reconnected normally. I can't explain it, but you can go out of here and live your life." And that's what Barbara's been doing for the last 38 years. I tell you that story not to say, hey, just become a follower of Jesus and you can get whatever you want whenever you want. I mean, we all know that miracles by definition are rare. Miracles, by definition, are the exception, not the rule, and happen in accordance with the divine calculus that we humans have never been able to figure out. I mean, let's face it, each and every one of us, myself included, even Barbara, will eventually die of something. Although I'm not very technical, I am fascinated by these things called aging apps. Are you familiar with them? With an aging app, it'll like show you what you're going to look like 40 years in the future. So the other day, I had this aging app, and I said, "David, look at this aging app." David took one look and said, "Jeff, that's the mirror." Has that ever happened to you? You look yourself in the mirror and you say, "Is that what I'm going to look like someday?" Every single one of us will eventually succumb to something. So the point of miracles in the Bible and miracle stories is not, hey, you can magically get out of every difficult situation that you face. Well, then what is the point of miracles? Have you ever thought about that? Why is it that God, on rare occasions, seems to suspend the laws of nature that surround us and do something that defies the laws of nature? I believe the answer is it's God's way of periodically reminding us, I am still with you. Jesus, the risen Christ, still walks the earth, and that means in any given situation, anything is possible, and that in turn gives us hope, because it means that regardless whether God gives me a miracle that delivers me out of a difficult situation or miraculously strengthens me to triumph through a difficult situation, either way, we are more than conquerors through Christ who loves us. Romans 8:37. you're not alone. There is no lack of power in any situation that you face in your life. Once upon a time, there was a little town known as Duckburg that was populated entirely by ducks. Every Sunday morning, all of the ducks would get up, waddle out of their house down Main Street, all the way to the First United Church of Duckburg. They would waddle down the aisle and squat in their favorite pew, like many of you do. I mean, the favorite pew part, not the waddling part. Though some of you do waddle a bit. Once they were all seated, the bell rang and the choir, the duck choir, waddled into the choir loft, sang a beautiful anthem, followed by songs of praise, and then eventually came the point in the service where the duck preacher got up to preach. This is what he said. My fellow ducks, God has given you wings. With wings, you can fly. With wings, you can mount up and soar like eagles. No walls can confine you. No fences can contain you. God has given you wings, and with wings, you can fly like birds. All the ducks shouted out, Amen. Preach it. Glory to God. Then when the service was over, they all waddled home. Get it? They just heard that God gave them wings. That was exciting. But none of them had the courage to dare to try it, to dare to live it. Jesus' brother put it this way: be ye doers of the word and not hearers only. My fellow ducks, God has put me here today to tell you that Jesus Christ is still with you, that Jesus Christ has not gone anywhere, that God is with you, and therefore there is no situation that you face where there is a shortage of power. So don't waddle out of here. Go out of here and soar the way Jesus meant it to be. But this gift we got on that first Christmas is not just about power. It's also about presence. The gift of presence. There is nothing worse than feeling alone. And there's nothing better than when you experience the presence of God. In fact, the gift of presence is probably even more important to the quality of our life than the gift of power. 8 years ago, one morning, I was boarding a plane for Orlando, Florida, headed to a huge church conference where I'd been invited to give a plenary series of lectures about homosexuality and the Bible. I walked in the airport up to the counter and asked the attendant behind the counter to please assign me a window seat. I prefer window seats when I fly. So she tapped on the keys and printed out a boarding pass, said, "Here you go." "Thanks," I said, went off to the gate. Finally, it was time to board the plane. My row numbers were called. So as I walk onto the plane, of course, you know how it is. The whole aisle of the plane is filled with people who are trying to stuff their overstuffed luggage in the overhead bin. So you can't move anywhere. By the way, you people who do that, I've got a bone to pick with you. Check your bags. That's why God created baggage check, right? So anyway, I get on the plane. There's this line all the way up and down the plane. Finally, there's some movement, and I start to notice the row numbers as I go back trying to figure out where it is I'm going to be seated. I have a pretty high number, but not that high. And so I'm watching the rows as I go, and as I'm about halfway back, I realize, whoa, I may be all the way near the back of the plane. When I'm about 10 or 15 feet from the back of the plane and watching the rows, I realize I could be in the very last row. You know, where the plane narrows? where there's a restroom right behind you that when it flushes sounds like it's going to suck you out into space? And where in the place where a window is supposed to be, they just have a little indentation? You ever notice that? Why do they put an indentation there if they're not going to put a window there? I realized that I have been assigned the very last seat in the very last row that has no window, just a place where a window was supposed to be. And as I'm standing there looking over to ample people who are already sitting in the two seats closest to the aisle that I need to crawl over, I've never been claustrophobic before. But in that moment, I felt panicked. Inside my head, I was saying, I can't do this. I got to get off this plane. I'm going to have to catch another plane. I can't do this. Then another voice in my head was saying, you got to do this. If you get off this plane, you may not catch another plane. You may miss your speaking engagement. You've got to do this, but I can't do this, but you've got to do this. I took a deep breath, crawled across those two people, slithered down into my tiny little confined seat, closed my eyes, and said, Jesus, you have got to be with me. And I can't explain it, but I felt the presence of a peace wash over me, and everything was okay. It was a beautiful flight. More than enough room. Because God was with me. God is with you too. Open your heart to that presence. Expect to encounter that presence. Feel that presence. Don't waddle out of here. Jesus came so that you can soar. So, to recap, on that first Christmas, for all of time, God gave us the gift of power. God gave us the gift of presence. And lastly, God also gave us the privilege of sharing those two gifts with those around us. The gift that God has given us is not meant to be hoarded. Let me close with this. Late one morning, Ruth went out to her mailbox, opened it, found a single envelope hand-addressed. She took it back inside, sat down in her chair, and noticed that the envelope seemed kind of odd. No stamp, no postmark, no return address. Curious, she opened it up, and inside was a handwritten note that read, Dear Ruth, I'm going to be in your neighborhood today. I'd like to have lunch with you. Love always, Jesus. Her hand began to quiver as she put the letter down on the table as she thought to herself, why is Jesus coming to visit me? I'm nobody special. I've got nothing to offer. I must have done something wrong. Her second thought was, what am I going to feed Jesus? My cupboards are bare. Quickly, she grabbed her purse and started to count up the money she had left. It was near the end of the month. She had only $10. She thought to herself, well, that's better than nothing. And so she threw on her winter coat, headed out the front door, briskly walked several blocks to the corner grocery store. There she got some turkey, cold cuts, a loaf of French bread, and some grape juice, because what else is a Baptist going to serve Jesus to drink than grape juice? And so then with these meager groceries, she's now walking briskly back toward her house, focused and concentrated, wondering, what is it going to be like to encounter Jesus, and what will I say? And when her train of thought was interrupted by a voice. Excuse me, ma'am. I'm homeless. It's cold. Anything you could spare, I would be so grateful for. She stops in her tracks and says, I'm so sorry. I've just spent my last $10 and all I've got are these few groceries, and I've got a guest coming for lunch. I'm sorry I can't help you today. Sure, he says, that's okay. Thanks anyway. She walks on. Stops. Starts to walk again. Stops. Turns around. Sir, she says, come back. Here. I want you to have these groceries. But what about your guest? Somehow I'll make do. Thank you, ma'am. She turns and starts to walk away. Stops again. Sir, she says, I've got a coat just like this one at home. So I know it's not your style, but here, I want you to have this. It'll help keep you warm. A tear formed in the corner of his eye. She rushed on home, thinking to herself, oh no, I hope Jesus likes popcorn. That's all I've got left. Rushes up to the front door, fumbling with her keys. She notices an envelope stuck in the door. Oh, she's so frustrated. Jesus came to her house and she missed him. Went inside, sat down, opened the envelope, and the note read, Dear Ruth, it was so good to see you today. The food was great, the coat even better. Love always, Jesus. As she sat there, she shed a tear, thinking to herself, I saw Jesus today. Whatever you do to the least of these, Jesus said, you have done it unto me. It's strange. It's a mystery. But when you be Jesus to somebody, not only do they experience him in you, you experience him in them. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, Jesus said, there am I in their midst. Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Next week, the week after Christmas, we here at Life Journey actually get the opportunity to put that principle into practice. Because the week after Christmas, somebody really important, somebody greater than even Peyton Manning, is going to be in our building. Jesus is going to be in our building in the form of 4 homeless families that we're going to host for the week. If your schedule permits, participate in that. Don't miss the blessing. Don't miss the encounter. You can read more about it in your bulletin, and on the back of your bulletin, there's a response form. Don't miss out on the blessing. But don't get me wrong, what we're talking about today is not just how we interact with homeless people. It's how we interact with everybody around us. You are a carrier of the presence and power of God. You are a carrier of the presence and power of Jesus Christ, who is still with us. God's presence and power, born into a manger, now born into you. So share that presence and power with your spouse, children, parents, difficult family members, co-workers, clerk behind the checkout counter. Be Jesus to them so that they will know and feel God is with me too. And that means I too can be a carrier of the presence and power of the Almighty. And that changes everything. What a gift. Merry Christmas. Amen.